All right, so thank you all for joining us today. My name is Brittany Garrett, and I am the Collections and Research Public Programming Specialist here at Old Sturbridge Village. And tonight, it is my pleasure to welcome you all to the Collections and Research Department's webinar, Celebration, Commemoration, and the Use of Public Space. So tonight, we will be discussing the use of public space for the purposes of celebration and commemoration by examining who had access to it and how it was and currently is being utilized. Tonight, our discussion will be led by Derek Heidemann, Old Sturbridge Village's Director of Collections and Research. But before I hand things over to him, I have a few technical things to share. This program is being recorded and will be posted on the Old Sturbridge Village YouTube page, which I encourage you all to visit. There will also be a question and answer session following our discussion tonight. So I invite our live viewers to submit questions at any point during the presentation in the Q&A feature at the bottom center of your screen. And tonight's webinar is funded thanks to the Bridge Street sponsorship from Mass Humanities. Bridge Street sponsorship allows funding for free online programs hosted by Massachusetts historical societies, centers, museums, or historical societies, such as OSV, to enable free access to learning and educational opportunities. So we thank them very much for their support. And now, without any further ado, I'm going to pass things over to Derek to introduce our guests.
Thank you, Brittany, and evening, everyone. So as many of you know, our exhibit celebrating our 75th anniversary of our museum, New England on Parade, focuses on the history of parades in New England. And it's heavily influenced by the work of Jane Nylander in her recent book, The Best Ever Parades in New England, 1788 to 1940. Now, the exhibit spans 3 galleries here at the museum that are spread out throughout the museum, and it will be open until July of next year. So if you haven't experienced the exhibit yet, we definitely urge you to do so. When thinking about parades in other forms of public celebration or commemoration, both in the past and today, many of us not only think about the events themselves, but the locations in which they take place. And that's exactly what we want to dive into in more detail as the focus of our discussion this evening. To take us through this discussion, we have 2 experts joining us that are involved with our Foundations of Interpretation project, which is funded by the National Endowment for the Humanities. That 3-year project seeks to reground really the very basis of our public programming in the most current research so that we can continue to connect to our visitors and connecting them to the past through relevant and accurate telling of history of the early 19th century in New England. So joining us, we have Linda Coombs, a member of the Aquinnah Wampanoag tribe, historian and museum consultant, and Cathy Stanton, senior lecturer of the Department of Anthropology at Tufts University, both of which have played critical roles in the Foundations of Interpretation project. And before we really dive into this discussion tonight of public lands as sites of celebration and commemoration, I want to give them the chance to take the floor and talk a little bit more about why they joined the NEH project and how their unique expertise relates to the topic of this webinar. So with that, I'll hand it over to Linda to start.
Good evening, everyone. Thank you for joining us and thank you for having me. Just a little bit about my background, because that'll help me answer the question a little more. I began my museum career. My background is in museum work in 1974, so it's been a little while. And I started at the Boston Children's Museum, where I worked for a total of 11 years. I worked for 30 years in the Wampanoag program at Plymouth Plantation, when it was Plymouth Plantation. And I worked at the Aquinnah Cultural Center, which is a small house museum on Martha's Vineyard, which deals with Aquinnah Wampanoag history specifically. And throughout all of these years, my focus has been on Wampanoag history and cultures, primarily the appropriate representation and interpretation of it. And so when I was asked to join, Old Sturbridge Village's interpretation project, I was, very, very excited to be asked to be part of it, because to me, the interpreters, the frontline staff, they can make or break of the visitor's experience. And, the knowledge that they have and the way that they learn to communicate it is extremely important to how history is told, how history is represented, whether it's told, I guess, appropriately or not. So it's very critical that, to me, that museums do it right, if you will. So.
Great, go ahead, Cathy, you can be next. Thank you.
Thanks, Derek. It's great to be here. Hi, everybody. So I'm a cultural anthropologist with a side of history. I study, I do the study of history, interested in what people do with the past, how we interact with it, but I also do historical research myself. So I started out with the study of military reenactment and sort of performance of history, but then got moving toward thinking more about place and historic sites and commemorative behaviors at particular places, including their use in economic redevelopment projects and relating to tourism, so how that fits together. And then lately being the last 10 years or so, I've been thinking more about food and farming, and not so much about history per se, although there are some links there, but really more about present day food systems and food systems change. But then there are a few projects that I've been able to do which have really bridged those two things, which have been super fun for me. So particularly thinking about the interpretation of the past of agriculture at historic sites in this time when a lot of what we now think of as sort of past forms of agriculture are coming back into currency, and people are asking, like, why did we go down this path that has led to this food, very, very large scale industrialized food system that we have now. So it's interesting to me to think about historic sites in dialogue with what we sometimes call the food movement, or the idea of transforming somehow the food, our food system, into something that is fairer, more sustainable, and healthier for the planet, for everyone. So the foundations of interpretation and Old Sturbridge Village, just in general, is this sort of sweet spot for me between these two bodies of interest. So thinking about what we do with the past, but also thinking about what we know or don't know about our food system, and about farming, most of us who are not farmers. And OSV is just this particularly interesting site to be doing that, because the 1830s is just like the time when all of that was really getting going, and we can really trace not just the roots of the food system that we have now, but literally questions that were being asked then that we've never actually figured out. So it's a really good place to kind of keep asking those questions. It's been really exciting to be part of this process.
Great, thank you, Cathy. So again, our exhibit that we're talking about, New England on Parade, really just focused on parades, but I want this discussion to be bigger. I want us to get into more of a discussion of any kind of public celebration, commemoration, any of these kinds of events, and linking that to place. So I guess, of course, we're always talking about trying to link the past more to the present, but let's start by thinking a little bit more historically. So historically, who had claim to public land? And and kind of we can even define public land when we're answering this question, I guess. But who has claim to it, and any other civic spaces, and what does that say about the various points of the past?
And I forget who was going to lead off on that one.
Well, I, if you don't mind, before
Sure, that'd be great.
I think, what that makes me think of right off the bat is, how did this become public land? At what point, how did it transfer from indigenous hands to non-indigenous, to bring up the question of being public land or some other type of land?
So. No, thank you for that. That's a really good way to start this off.
And I can kind of just build on that basic insight there, that that whole conception of like public land or civic space is really a European understanding and a framing and a shaping of what land is. And it makes that sort of public-private distinction in a way that is very culturally grounded in European understandings. And then, we see this with the arrival of colonists here, that there's this understanding that different kinds of people have different levels of claim, and to be a white male landowner gave you the strongest claim. And we're still working out what that means, right, in terms of who has claim to public land. And a lot of it tends to get worked out in ways that just kind of reinforce that same framework, really, when you think about something like the National Mall, where, and these have been really important projects, to have something like the National Museum of the American Indian or the National African American Museum of History and Culture, that incredibly important and profound projects and really fascinating spaces, but they're still within that understanding and framework, right? Just like you kind of play that same game as like, and now we have a museum on the mall, and that doesn't shift anything about the basic kind of understanding. And maybe just to also key off that image, if people saw at the beginning of the Sturbridge Green, just that these are often, when we talk about public spaces or civic spaces, they're very particular kinds of spaces, and they may be that sort of manicured green that's usually got very straight sides and nice mowed grass, and that's about kind of control, right, over and controlling nature. So, and then we also have kind of wild spaces that may be public, but are also kind of curated and marked off as separate. And it's like humans have declared this to be nature, and then so it's sort of both of those things in very different ways create that separation.
I think that just what Cathy has been talking about with European or Western society, Western thinking coming in, that's what even created the need to have museums that have certain focuses so that we can retain connection in some form or fashion, as a way to remember.
That's a really good point. That's a really good point. So I guess in thinking about, how this is, we're already kind of building this bridge to how this has changed a little bit. In some cases stayed the same. I mean, are there any immediate examples that come to mind for either of you of these kind of either changes in patterns or how we are still seeing ourselves stuck in the same pattern, or at least even more awareness of those patterns and trying to kind of counteract that, I guess?
Could you explain a little more about that?
Sure. So just in terms of, in the past, I mean, certainly there were certain ways that the land had been used, and obviously there's a change from indigenous use of the land to more European influence. How different types of or different societies, different towns will use the land a little bit differently, different groups of people. So how has that changed today, or how has that pattern stayed the same?
Well, when I look at land use with indigenous people prior to contact in our traditional setting, if you will, we didn't look at land as what can we do with it. We looked at it as what is the land telling us as to how it should be treated. And when Europeans came, that's when that flipped to the what can we do with it? And they would accuse us of not properly manuring it and ordering it, and and all this sort of thing, like they did. But to me, the way that land, to me, that just didn't work. It seemed like it worked for a while, and when you're in the 1830s, like at Sturbridge there, you still have vast forests and farms and meadows and all of that stuff, but then that same thought pattern, that same way of thinking carried forward to today, and look where we're at. I mean, that's the way I look at it.
Yeah, I would agree, and I think there's just that progression kind of where we're at, where there's kind of the fights over developable land or preservable land, right? Like kind of what's left to be either developed, so-called developed, or preserved, are often very fraught, and especially anywhere near a city or anywhere that real estate is, is valued in monetary terms in that way. That's where I'm sort of thinking about tourism and recreation, and how often the argument is made that we should save this land or preserve it or make it put in a museum or whatever because it will attract tourists. And it's maybe not the worst reason to save land. At least you're saving it, or not saving it, but you're at least keeping it from being developed or paved over. But it does put it into that framework of there's some economic benefit, right? It's supposed to be to attract people or to boost your image or whatever it is. So it's like stuck in that framework. I also think I see, just in terms of, because I'm thinking about commemorative behavior and access. You were asking, Derek, about access, like who has access or can make claims on land. More of a closing down, or we say like an enclosing of spaces, bureaucratically or through like legal and rules kind of ways. So, and that's been happening the last 20 years or so, particularly. And the idea that now there's designated free speech zones, which are usually this big, and they have a wire fence around them, and like that's where you can actually exercise free speech. But that there's a lot of that more sort of locked down or again very controlling constraining of who has access, and saying, of course, anybody can say anything they want right here in this little box. So, and that's something that happened. It's kind of around the anti-globalization protests and around the time of the second Iraq War. That's when you started to get that really being kind of coded into the way these spaces are being patrolled. And so it's, and even at places that are ostensibly wide open, like national parks, there's still a little free speech zone. So.
Yeah, absolutely. Absolutely. And again, like I said, at the beginning, I think, so often when we think of different types of commemorations, we do think of those particular places where they happen. And often that can have as much of an identifier for whatever that event is as the actual event that's happening there. I'm thinking about different types of parades or commemorations or memorials that happen in various places. So can you both give some examples of different celebrations or commemorations from the past and in the present as well, that were or are very strongly tied to a particular location? Doesn't need to be necessarily a public event. It can even be more of kind of a private ceremonial event, but just trying to think of different examples like that are so tied to place.
I've got a couple of examples. I can throw one in and then toss it to Linda. And
sure, that'd be great. That'd be great.
Yeah. And this is I mean, there's so many I can think of, but I'm interested in ones that have a place where there's sort of multiple layers of meaning or resonance in a place, that, how much of a meaning a landscape can hold. And sometimes they're even contradictory meanings that people read into them. So one example was that for 7 years, I was part of a peace vigil in Orange, which is next to the town I live in, Orange, Mass, where there's a World War I statue that people refer to as the peace statue, but they interpret it really differently. So some people say it's saying like there should never be any more war, and other people are saying we won the war. It's like, so it's read either as sort of pro-military or anti-war. And so we stood there every Saturday for 7 years, silently in a peace vigil. And sometimes people came and expressed other opinions at the same time, not silently. And so it was a very complex space that I really came to appreciate, because there could be like literal, not confrontation because we didn't confront, but contradiction within the space that felt like over time it actually created a little bit more breathing room in the public discourse around particularly the Iraq War, was what we were vigiling about, but locally, just that it somehow made it a more complex discussion than sort of a more simplistic, like just a parade that would have one point of view, that this somehow contained radically different ways of thinking about this. So I don't know if that would still work today. I feel like things have become much more polarized and polarizing, but even at that point, we stopped in 2008. It did feel like it accomplished something because we were in that particular resonant space that everybody felt some connection to. But and Linda has, when we talked about this in the run through, I think Linda also shifted my thinking about that a little bit as well.
I was just thinking as you were asking the question, Derek, that in our traditional societies, we didn't have commemorations and parades per se. We had ceremony.
Mm-hmm.
That was part of our spiritual life, and they could absolutely be tied to certain places depending on what the ceremony was and what the place was, because those were in sync, and ceremony was all about acknowledgement of other beings in life, other living beings, thanksgiving, gratefulness, that sort of thing. And so it's a very different concept than parades and commemorations in today's society. I mean, today we have powwows, and they can be held just as a general public event. They can be held because it's somebody's birthday or whatever, family reasons or community reasons, this sort of thing. Somebody might host a powwow, which is a dance, essentially. But as you were asking the question, the one thing that popped in my mind was the Thanksgiving Day parade in Plymouth. And for the last 25 years, The organizers have wanted us to march in the parade with the pilgrims, like everything's okay. And we're going, we can't do that. You know, broken record, can't do that, can't do that. And the reason is, it's like, the reason for that parade is they're celebrating the landing of the pilgrims and the establishment of Plymouth and the establishment of America. And in order for those things to happen, that land had to be taken from us. And we're not going to be out there marching and helping you celebrate that. So let's, you know, that's it.
Yeah, rightfully so. Yeah.
Linda, when we
Give
talk
it a perseverance, though.
when we talked this through before, Linda, you also said something that really stuck with me. I gave my little peace statue example, and that you said, yeah, that's what people do on the land, but it's not about the land. And
Yes.
the light bulb kind of went on. It's like we're on the surface there, and that it was, you know, it's sort of a place that people have made, and we plant that statue there, and it is a very resonant place for a lot of people, but it's also just on that surface, kind of a, you know, sitting on the land, but not kind of rooted or grounded in it.
That's something that just has, you know, over the last few years has sort of occurred to me. And as I go along, it just becomes more solidified in my mind that the monuments, the events like parades, you know, it's all about something that people do. No one is out there celebrating what God or what the Creator has made because we're too busy destroying it. Like it doesn't matter. You know, and I often tell people, to me, that's like spitting in the face of God. To destroy what was made, what was created.
I think where we got to in that discussion was saying that, strangely, then the flip side of that is like we go make a wilderness park, right? It's like, okay, we're destroying things over here, but we're going to go save them over there, and put a boundary around it and have a road into it, and that's going to be how we assuage our, you know, our sense of guilt or loss, or, you know, just cluelessness about what's actually happening. But that we get that sort of prophylactic kind of dose of nature after having destroyed it in so many places.
And
Yeah.
that reminds me, when I see that, if this makes sense, it's like, you know, how we were put on reservations, we were moved to certain pieces of land that were out of the way or unwanted at the time, or, you know, what, this sort of thing, to just remove us. And that's like what's being done to land, or we'll fence off this land and make it a park. It's like the land is being put on its own reservation, if you will. You know,
Right.
That's how it strikes me.
Yeah, absolutely. It's like this obsession with, you know, public land has to be something that was sculpted by mankind in order for it to actually be public. There can't be this notion of, no, it's already meant to be there for people to use for various purposes, or just to be there, right? And that's, I mean, in thinking about this webinar, I mean, one of the questions we were thinking about kind of framing this, or part of it, is the landscape and in these events where they're taking place, you know, is this expressive of culture, just the landscape itself? And I think thinking about it in this way, yes and no, right? Because when we think of the more traditional, like you were saying, Linda, the more, you know, like the parades, the celebrations, these things where they're literally happening in a sculpted environment, although certainly not as you know, we are, you know, a public institution, but we're not like a national park service site here at OSV. But I think about different types of events that we hold here. But again, we're trying to sculpt it in this whole context of the 1830s. So it's even happening here when you think about it that way, is we're trying to recreate this thing. So it goes back so far.
Yeah. And I mean, you just said, you know, these spaces for people to use or for land to just be. But land is something that we should build a relationship with. It's not just there for us to use. I mean, we take everything we need, food, clothing, shelter, you know, all, water, all of it, of course. But there's a way to do that so that the land, the earth is left as it was created. And that's the piece that doesn't happen. You know, you go up to the line, but then we don't complete the whole process. So it becomes land is there to use. And land is, you know, has a right, in my estimation, And from when I talk to other tribal people, it has its own right to its life, just like, and everything on it. Plants, animals, birds, critters, bugs, whatever, have a right to their life without humans having to make some decision about that.
And you're right, Derek, that the very conception of the public, a public, is, first of all, it's a human public, right? That's when we think about the public, it's a human public, but it's also a particular public. And there's been a lot of scholarship on that, of kind of how a public is called into being, and there's a lot of kind of mechanisms by which that happens. But some of it is that sculpting of space and the disciplining of bodies as we move through it, and including in parades, like marching in a straight line down a street, right?
Mhm.
That is in the same way that kind of walking through a museum exhibit is a kind of a discipline, and a kind of creating a certain narrative and slotting yourself into it, right? That's part of the mechanism, is like how someone becomes part of a public. It's that you understand what it is expected to be. But so it goes really deep, including this word that seems often to be like undeniably good, is public, right? It's sort of assumed to be a good or a civic good, but it is worth unpacking that as you're doing here. Yeah.
Mhm, mhm. So kind of tied to this discussion, can either of you think, just like thinking about specific examples of different commemorations, celebrations, ceremonies, things like that, can you think of any specific examples of the direct impact? I mean, I know, Linda, you've given a bunch of broader examples of just the general shift in the damage to the environment as a result of so much. But can you think of specific examples, either of you, of the impact of some type of public use of space on the land? I know we were talking a little bit as we were kind of thinking this through about, like, the impact of industry or other things like that, or like in the building of, again, the building of the public, like you were saying, Cathy, around industry or things like that.
Yeah. I mean, that example, my other example I was thinking of in terms of the place connection was the what was called Pasquiamscot. It was the native village at what's now Turner's Falls in Massachusetts. So it's town on the other side of me. So there's the Connecticut River and a massive waterfall, and was always and I guess year-round village, but a very large seasonal fishing town, as natives used to do to gather for fishing and ceremonies, and really significant place. And it was part of it was a very large battle there, and during King Philip's War, and a famous massacre. And then kind of a running battle that people are still realizing kind of how big a deal that was. But so there's something there, a project called the Nulambika Project, which is there's some Native and mixed heritage people and some white allies have founded this organization to kind of make that more widely known just in general in this area. It's been sort of a colonized site, and it's also an industrial site, because Turner's Falls is one of those New England towns where they took this whole massive river, built a canal, and made a power canal out of it. So Lowell is like that, Holyoke's like that. There's all kinds of places are like that. So it's this actually fascinating industrial landscape, very large scale. And the whole river runs through this canal and then gets sort of dumped out further down. So every year for almost a decade now, I think there's been something called the Pocumtuck Homelands Festival there, which is, and that is a very resonant place to me. That's the more I think about this and the more I learn about the kind of the deeper histories of this part of the world, to have that festival there, which is not a powwow, but sort of a gathering of all kinds of different people. But natives from around the area as well. So it's really, there's a lot of layers in that landscape, and there's a reframing of it. And to me, I don't know how many people think of this, but I just feel the violence of that rerouting of the river. It's just, it's such a powerful river, and it really just sort of, sucks it out of the riverbed and then there's nothing but rocks and, some poor little trees that are trying to grow there, and then, and uses it. And it's a very classic example of kind of using that power. And it'll be interesting to see how that festival, I think, continues to develop if they do it in terms of that more, I think, sort of ecological sense of what that place is and was, and maybe might be again.
In terms of like industry, in indigenous thinking, we feel that Creator has provided us with everything we need in the natural world as it was created, which didn't include industry, at least as it's developed, in today's world, which is so destructive. And yet there's a perception that, the life that we had was backward and primitive and very difficult, and everything took so long and it was terrible, and we froze to death and starved to death. And those are all perceptions that, are rooted in stereotype, which began as justifications for taking the land. Because, when we were at Plymouth, we would often tell people that, we worked the equivalent of 2 days a week and kind of had like 5 days off. Because we just, our life was our life, getting the things that we needed to sustain our lives and our families. And we didn't have the 9 to 5, on top of that. So we could focus on that. And one thing that always used to strike me, like back in the 60s and into the 70s, if you saw a photograph of, I remember seeing photographs of like Native Americans or like Maasai people from Africa and different indigenous people like that. And particularly if it was a young person, the expression on their face was just like serene and secure, because they knew their place in the world. And you look at people today, and you get more frowny or, whatever, more issues you can see that are in their mind that they have to grapple with. And to me, that just speaks of these indigenous ways of life and how they actually worked, as opposed to how they're presented to the rest of the world, So, and it's almost like people with industry, they create things. Oh, we need this. Well, we need to have a building because now we're trying to do blah, blah, blah. And, oh, now we need a bigger building, and we have to put cement footings in that go down to the bedrock in the earth, 95, however many feet, and this sort of thing, and to support a skyscraper. And it's like, people all over the world, indigenous people got along. And whenever anybody was indigenous, in that living that way, lived very well and very comfortably, and they had the knowledge and the skill and the ability to make all the things that they needed. And it just, apparently it wasn't a huge deal to do so. People like at Plymouth, they used to ask us about stone tools, for example. Oh, it just must take so long to like peck away and make a stone axe head or something. And it's like, well, it couldn't have been too bad because there's like 94 million of them in museums, all over the place. So,
No, I totally understand that, especially, having worked here in the trades, for instance, at OSV. I mean, and there's so many other examples, I think, thinking about us and doing other living history, where there's an assumption that because something is from the past, that means it is obsolete, right? That it's an antiquated way of doing something, when in reality, I mean, to me, the part that's so exciting about studying the past and the real recreation of it in terms of what we do here at OSV is getting into the minds of the people that were actually using these things and finding whether it be the economies and the way they did, or just getting into their whole thought press and their being of how these things interacted with their life. And that, to me, is the really cool connection, really cool connection.
And that happened a lot at Plymouth. We were just in this outdoor living history site, doing the stuff that our ancestors did, and you're doing it every day for at least 8 months of the year, and the other 4 months you're preparing to do it. And if you worked there for any length of time, any number of years, you really got into that mode of thinking how people thought in the 17th century, and particularly how our ancestors thought, because we used to have the opportunity to go out and get the natural materials that we needed to make the houses or whatever, this sort of thing. And I think one of the most exemplary times that I had was one day sitting, it was a balmy fall day, just kind of like today. It was mild and just lovely. And I spent like 3 hours one afternoon grinding corn in a mortar and pestle. And after 3 hours, I ended up with, roughly like what would have filled a 5-pound bag you'd buy at the store of cornmeal. And I just enjoyed it so much, and I'm like, wow, I wonder if, it had to be like that for our ancestors, because they just lived there in that place, all the time. They didn't have to pack it up and go home at 5 o'clock. They were home, so.
Yeah, absolutely.
But yeah, so those experiences were very meaningful. And then when we got going with the language project, that brought in even more insight, particularly into relating to land and all the rest of it. So.
Yeah, it is interesting to think even just of those kind of everyday events, those everyday tasks as ceremony in and of themselves, right? And how that has shaped the landscape as a result. And so I think so often we think of commemoration, again, all these public events, it's these big blown out things, but in reality, so much of these kind of ceremonial things or these everyday things also have the same kind of impact.
I'm also thinking about, so in kind of placemaking, which is a trendy term in, kind of urban space development particularly, but there's this idea of like people activating places. This is your goal, is you're going to activate a place. You're going to like make it speak or something. But I'm just thinking that these kinds of actions of kind of everyday awareness and being in a place and commemorating in that sort of small scale way, you're not activating the place is there, but you're kind of reaching toward it, and maybe it's reaching toward you, and like there's something happening there at these sites that it really is living between the people and the land itself, the place itself.
You make me think, I've talked to like some of our own folks, community folks, and people, feel bad because they don't know the history, or they don't know the culture because of, all the processes of colonization that happened. And what I have noticed over the years, that it's not like you have to like teach people and you take this block of information, okay, now I'm going to give it to you, but it's more like it's in them, and it's a matter of bringing it out. It's been stuffed down, so now you bring it out. And it's like, I think it's the same thing with the land, because the land is what it is. And we have to not activate it, but see what it's about, listen to it, and see what is there that we're supposed to know about it, so we can act right with it.
That's the task for white people like myself. So I come from Ontario, and my family were colonizers. They came from England. They bought native land, and I bought or took. That's my kind of my background, and so that relationship is one that really unpacking that and what that means, and thinking what to do with that. I now live in a beautiful forested place that is, I bought this piece of land, and how to think in what my relation is and what to do with that. I think there's a whole, I don't see this happening a lot. Maybe that Nolan Bika project is sort of a gesture toward that, but as like what can be done for those of us who are from sort of a colonizer heritage to repair that, or to re-understand it, or to sit with it and be in a different relation to it. That's a different kind of commemoration, or a ceremony, a different kind of ceremony, I guess, of being in place. But I do think that historic sites and kind of historic observations can play a really interesting role in that. It's almost like a gateway into beginning to think of that. I'm always struck at Sturbridge of there's the manicured green and the buildings all around it and stuff, and then right around it is the forest, right? It's the path that leads up into the forest, and it's like it's just they're right next to each other, and I think this has been part of the fun of the Foundations of Interpretation, is thinking about ways to to have that, just to have those places be in closer dialogue with each other, rather than like the forest is like a backdrop for the village, or the village has been carved out of the forest, but to see them, to kind of bring them into a dialogue, and us with them.
Yeah.
Oh, absolutely. So we talked a little bit about thinking more about today about the use of land for different types of ceremony and commemoration. I could go down the list again. I've said it a million times already. But thinking about there's so much more regulation of it today, right? So it's the town, it's the state, it's the federal government that's mandating who actually has access to use these pieces of land. And we talked a little bit about, again, Cathy had mentioned this about, as coming from a background of white colonizers, this whole idea of what do we need to do to ensure that these types of events can continue to happen, or some that have been suppressed can actually happen. So in thinking about, this increasing regulation and the use of public land for public events, what's the impact there? What's the I guess what I'm trying to ask is, how is the use of that land and the regulation of it impacting what is actually able to happen there, and how can we try to change that? I guess maybe that's too broad of a question for that. I don't know. It's aspirational.
Well, that question comes, out of the paradigm that we're in, as Cathy was talking about earlier, regulating space, and what you were just saying, Cathy, about the land that you bought, and I think part of the answer anyway is that people need to get back to, or not get back to, but get with what it means to be in right relationship with the land. And that's our responsibility as human beings, according to indigenous ways, all human beings. So you're here on this land now, your responsibility to it or with it is no different from ours. And because if people were thinking right about the land, there wouldn't be the need for regulation.
Oh, very good points.
But people don't, because there's the worry of vandalism, or whatever, or this type of thing.
We're afraid of each other and afraid of the divisions that exist. I was thinking about the idea of public land versus a commons, and the people that are trying to get back to the idea of a commons, or the thing that is truly shared. And again, that's a European notion, but it is closer to the idea of collective stewardship and collective use, and so it's not like a completely separate curated thing that's off to the side, but it is something that can be shared and used not just for human benefit, but kind of stewarded together. And there's interesting projects all over the place that are trying to, things like community land trusts that are trying to legally kind of meld the combination of private ownership and deeds and those things, but with that aspiration of having it be more of a commonly held. I mean, those are very teeny tiny little projects, Derek. That's not it's not going to like change the whole framework there, but it is interesting. It's suggestive that people are groping toward that and trying to rethink what it would mean to hold not, well, in some places to hold space or to hold places in common, but also to shift that relationship in terms of what who's driving, who's actually in control. Is it the people, or is it the land?
Great. All right.
Man.
Yeah. Well, thank you both so much. This has been excellent. I've really enjoyed this discussion, talking about this. It's a really interesting way to be thinking about public events and even just different types of commemoration. So with that, we're actually going to turn it over to the audience. So if anyone in the audience would like to ask any questions of our speakers, we welcome you to just enter those into the Q&A right now, and we will get them to answer them for you.
We don't have any questions yet, but we did have a comment earlier. anonymous. So they said, what a wonderful, thoughtful discussion. Thank you all. All this talk about land and the environment and indeed cultures, however, seems to ignore the 800 gorilla in the room, the gross overpopulation of the planet. So it's not necessarily a question, but if there's any way we can discuss that, or if you guys would like to discuss that, that would be great.
I think that's a very good point. Well, one thing, I think of it in terms of, some of the movements today to make abortion illegal, or to just ban family planning or birth control and this sort of thing. And it's like, the people who are proponents of that, I mean, are you even looking around? Because that is what's going on. The entire planet is overpopulated. And, and that is something that does need to be contended with at some point, last week, never mind yesterday, it should have begun, and, and again, one of the things that we used to interpret at Plymouth was that Indigenous people, we did practice birth control with plants, different plant medicines and things like that, because we were aware of how many people a certain land area could support, and we were cognizant of that, and we lived by that. And we had a sizable population, but the land was not destroyed by our presence and our living on it and our activities on it. And it was thriving and healthy, and
It's a really complicated question. And I don't have an answer for it, but there's debate about it. Is the world grossly overpopulated? Is it just unevenly populated in terms of that carrying capacity, or the what can be healthy for a given part of the planet? There are people who are saying like the carrying capacity isn't necessarily a fixed quantity. So that question of like, what is the magic number that can live on the planet? It depends how you're getting your food and how you're living. That it's certainly to have everyone living the way that Indigenous people have lived for millennia. We can't do with the current population and eat, because that would require so much land that it just doesn't exist. So the interesting thing to me, and I think a lot about cities too, and kind of urbanization, is that may be as much as overpopulation per se. It's like that question of how we live and where we live, that urbanization, which has become, it's just sort of run away in a lot of ways, sort of sucks people off the land, and immiserates them in a lot of ways, and further distances them from food supplies. Like that imbalance is something I do think a lot about in terms of how we get our food. So, and all of that relates to things like fossil fuels that it's not possible without a fossil fuel economy. So I don't know that there was a sort of a perfect balance of how many people could be on the planet based on who was living where. Again, I go back to the 1830s and think that's just a really interesting time when this sort of juggernaut of industry and the beginning of the fossil fuel economy and the capitalist economy and all those things, and the growth of those industrial cities was really starting to happen. And there's no question we're way beyond where it's balanced now, and it's going to be a heck of a job to get it back into some kind of balance. But I'm not sure that I'd point to population per se as the kind of the driver of all of that. It's almost a symptom in some ways of the imbalances in how we live.
And I mean, I'm not so quick to say, oh, we can't do what Indigenous people did because we don't have the land. I mean, I don't disagree with that, and I get what you're saying, but I think we need to take those concepts that our ancestors lived by and rethink them in the context of overpopulation or whatever other issues we're facing today. And I think some people are starting to do that. And I wonder, I was just saying this to someone yesterday, that Wampanoag people, for example, we got struck by a plague between 1616 and 1618 that wiped out 75 to 90% of our population. And entire villages went, entire bodies of knowledge, and and all sorts of things went when those people died. And then 2 years later, in 1620, here come the Pilgrims and began imposing all of these aspects of colonization on us. And we never really had the chance to get back on our feet, if you will, after the plague, before we had the interruption of colonization. And I think a lot of indigenous people that had a similar experience, but I just wonder, okay, so we were living in a certain way in 1620. If there had been no disease, no colonial interruptions, where would we be, 400 years later in today's world with the thinking,
And I think
that's as far as I've gotten with that thought. So
it's a great thought, and it's it's sitting with urbanization, the fact that, like, I mean, a lot of people did move out of cities during COVID, but the majority of people living in cities now are probably not going to move out of them. And there are good things to, sort of being concentrated as well. But it's like that mindset of, like, what would it mean to be an urban person, but to shift your whole thinking about what it means to relate to the planet, and not just in a facile way, not just I'm going to plant a tomato and feel like I'm in touch with the land, but or that sort of greenwashing way that that there's a lot of out there, but in a more profound way, and that could actually change to a sense of something more like stewardship. Yeah,
I have people say that a lot. Oh, we can't go back. So you think we're going forward? Is that what we're doing?
Yeah, and I
don't think so.
I think you get that also in the kind of the nostalgia for, like, old timey farming, and OSV kind of falls into this too. It's so pretty. It's so sweet. It really is. It's wonderful, and it's to kind of romanticize that way of living, or to just that nostalgic way of thinking about it. And to me, it's like it's a thing we can learn with and shift. Kind of really. Exactly as you were talking about, Linda, to kind of put our minds and our bodies back into those patterns and think, what does that feel like? What does it feel like to imagine living in a really different, radically different way?
Yeah.
Right, thank you, guys. So we have another question kind of tied to that. Do you think spaces like community gardens can be a viable reaction to urbanization, a way to reclaim land use as a means of supporting life rather than building over land?
It's a start. Good start. Yeah.
I agree. It is a start. I think a lot of people tend to see it as an end, as a, like, it's community gardens can do so many things. They get you in touch with the land, and they teach you skills, and sometimes they educate kids, and that I think there's a danger. That's maybe what I was thinking about, is a somewhat facile kind of a, like, okay, we've done this, we're in touch with the land now. That it is a start, and it's a question of listening and sitting with it and thinking, where does that get us? It's good. Everyone should know how to grow some food. Everyone put their hands in it. I'm not arguing with that, but just to be careful of what you expect might come out of that.
So we have another general question from Cathy. She says she's in Connecticut and thinking about spaces that decades or centuries ago were public spaces along the Connecticut coast. Now, most of these coastlines are closed to the public or open only to residents of the corresponding towns, and only if they pay for the use, or open to the public at less desirable times. Spaces that were once open to Native peoples for everyday use. The purposes of the lands have been changed to fit people's needs and not necessarily what the land was meant to be. And that's why I think these coastal lands are unsuccessful, because they exclude groups of people from using them. And she thanks you, Linda. She learned so much new stuff about Native peoples and how they view land purposes and respect the land. It's a different way of thinking. So I think that's very beautiful.
To me, I mean, and people tell me I'm foolish, basically, but I think that people generally need to shift the way they think about land, and not how we use it, but how we relate to it. You know, as the land and everything on it as living sentient beings. And the word respect is in there big time, and reciprocity. You know, and in my mind, that's just what it's going to take.
One of the interesting things about coasts is that even in European thinking, they were not seen as particularly developable or habitable, like full-time habit, like build your house there, spaces until the industrial era, when suddenly people were crowded into cities and wanted to get away. That's when vacationing started, that whole kind of recreation. So they were in some ways they were seen as like waste spaces there because they couldn't be developed or farmed. And in other ways, they were just seen as like, you wouldn't build their house there because the storm will come. Like, come on, duh. And it's only after that became a desirable form of recreation and escape from cities, which are often very terrible places to live in the summer, that people would start building hotels and cottages and then hardening that coastline. And then, you know, even before the climate started changing as much as it is now, it was a dumb thing to do because, you know, the sands shift and the water rises and falls and the tides come. And so those investments in coastal places that white people have made and are now protecting, right, to our dying breath, that we'll, you know, we'll just like ensure these things over and over again. And it's such an example of not listening to what the land is telling us, which is those spaces shift, and they always have, and they are even more now. But that's like a battle around that. And then you get something like Cape Cod National Seashore, which is, you know, interestingly to allow for that. But then people are kind of angry with that because they don't have as much access to it as they used to, and they, you know, sort of removed all the little cottage and shacks and things. So coasts are particularly, I think, vivid places for the places themselves are alive, they're shifting, and it's sort of in dialogue with the planet. But certain kinds of human thinking want to lock it down and build a place and then insure it for when it blows down, when the next hurricane comes. Yeah.
Well, they'd have access to that land. They just have to go swimming.
Right.
Mhm.
Right. And that's that recreational frame, right?
Yeah. So I think we have time for one more question. This one is from Alice. She says, any ideas for helping local land conservation groups in the US who are happy to acknowledge the past and present of Indigenous people, also feel comfortable allowing for a current Indigenous presence on conservation land that goes beyond the old Park Service slogan, take only photos, leave only footsteps?
It's a great question.
I don't know. I would just have to. Can you say it again?
Yeah. So any ideas for helping local land conservation groups in the US who are happy to acknowledge the past and present of Indigenous people and feel comfortable allowing for a current Indigenous presence on conservation land that goes beyond just the saying, take only photos and leave only footsteps. So maybe in some way adding some Indigenous presence to the landscape rather than just saying, you know, enjoy it, take pictures.
Right. Well, that could involve, again, how the land is used, how it's walked on, how you would enter it or leave it, what you do when you're there. That could all be very different from the whole recreational definition. You know,
Right.
and I think, you know, that really is a mental shift for people in today's society. Because they got the, you know, like you said, you know, take photos and leave footprints but it's more than that. You
Right.
know, what is it? How do we respect this land? What actually? Because it's more than taking photos and leaving footprints, whatever. You know, how do we respect the land? Really?
And I would just say that, you know, kind of the basic advice for any community engagement or, you know, kind of civic public engagement, those kinds of projects, but to build it out of relationship, that it's got to come from some kind of an actual relationship with, if they're looking to, partner with Indigenous groups or partners, just to make sure that it's not just sort of a, how do we bring some Indians back into the space? That's the kind of just add-on thing. Here we have the space here. Now we know we want to have some Indigenous people, so let's go get some. It's like, that's not a real relationship. And so you've got to somehow cultivate something that is more genuine. And because I think then the answer comes out of that is like, what do you do? How do you do it? Then you're able to talk about that and think about what that is. But I feel like that, I think a lot of white-led groups do that. They sort of jump right to here's the desired outcome. And really the whole point is the relationship and the processes that need to be solid and may take a really long time. And so that's, don't just sort of say, we've got a grant and we want to do this. I think that's how I would come at that. And I see land trusts, trying in very well-meaning ways to grapple with this heritage and this, because people in those land trusts are pretty smart usually, and a lot of them understand and get all the things we've been talking about, and kind of this legacy that's really problematic. And yet, when the moment comes to to take action, they want to sort of jump right to the fix and realize that you can't just get right straight there.
Yeah.
Because I say that to people all the time, it's like if we give a talk and we talk about what happened in history and people get all, involved in it at the moment and are emotionally overwrought with it. And like, what can we do? We want to do something. We want to help. And it's like, can we have a rally? Can we have a march, a vigil, or something, And it's my response is, number one, I don't really see what good, all long-lasting good that's going to have. It's going to be like a firecracker, fireworks thing for a minute, but then it's going to go away and okay, and it's a one-off, But so I tell people, learn the history of wherever you are. Learn the history of that area and learn about the Indigenous people of that area. Real history, learn how to read the history so you can sift out the stereotypes and the misinformation and the misconceptions and all of that stuff, So, which is a much longer commitment.
Wonderful. Well, thank you both so much for this wonderful conversation. It's been so interesting. If viewers did not catch the entire program or would like to share it, a recording of the webinar will be sent to our members in the following week, and it will also be uploaded to Old Sturbridge Village's YouTube page. Thank you again to Linda Coombs and Cathy Stanton and Derek. This was a great discussion, and I hope you all enjoyed it. I hope you all have a great night. Bye, everyone.
Bye.